Hi everyone. I'm going to follow up on last week's little video in which I read a section from my upcoming novel, To Live and Die in the Floating World, by reading another little part this week. The book is out in the fall, and it is set on a fictitious version of the boat I worked on many years ago, a very small tourist barge that plied the canals of Burgundy. It was a very rich experience. I only worked for a month, and yet the richness of it seems that it took a whole year in my memory. It was really a wonderful time. And I love to talk about it and love to write about it. And so I've set this suspense novel, To Live and Die in the Floating World, on a fictional version of the Wirianda, which I worked on. It's now called the Celeste. Now, as I say, I like to talk about the canals, so I'm going to take a moment to orient you in where the boat is working. It's on the canals of Burgundy. I'm going to show you a little map of France, and then I'm going to show you a map of the navigation charts that they give you for the canals. As you can imagine, they're very narrow because the whole world at this point comes down to that narrow canal, probably about 30-40 feet wide, and a couple hundred yards to each side. That's really your world. You seldom leave it when you're working or taking a tour on a canal barge. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that before I start reading the selection. Okay, here is a map of France, southern France, Marseille down there, Paris here. And the area of Burgundy in which this is set, in which I used to work, is roughly defined by the city of Dijon here. Famous for mustard and wines, and up through here to Fontainebleau. And there's a long circle here that the barge would take several months to navigate, with new guests coming on every week to 10 days, depending on the tour. And so this orients you on the map of France. And now I'm going to take you over to the other side of my little room here and show you the navigation maps you use when you're on the canals. Here are 3 pages from the little booklet of navigational maps they give you when you're on the canal. And they go one after the other, with the canal leaving off here and picking up at the top of the next page. And as I say, the world is just this canal and a couple hundred yards beyond it, and that's what the maps reflect. These little icons here will show you where the little towns are, where restaurants are, where you can service your boat with fuel or water, and it shows the roads in the area. Now here's one section of the canal. It's one that I actually use in the book. At one point, the Celeste, as the boat is called in the book, stops just outside the little village of Chateauneuf. And you can see here, as I say, here's the roads, here are woods around the canal. The canal is about 30 feet wide, so you can see this very small scale map. And if you can see them, there are these little double arrows all through here, a lot of them. And these are the locks. The locks take about 10 minutes apiece. So when you're on a stretch of canal where there aren't many locks, you can go quite a ways each day. But in a section like this, you're very busy. They're not mechanized. You have to push them open and closed yourself. And each one will take you quite a while. And when there are a bunch of them like this, you don't make a lot of progress during the day. And it's a very tiring day. Part of Kip's job was part of my job, and that was to jump out at every lock and help the lock keeper lock the boat through. And so, as I say, it can be a very wearying job. And this is the floating world on which the story is set. In this episode of the book, Kip Weston, who was the narrator and main character, has landed a job on the tourist barge Celeste, which normally takes 3 couples, just as the one I used to work on did. For those of you who saw last week's reading, he was tipped to this job by a friend who said he was quitting down there, and so there was an opening, and if he got down there quickly enough, he'd get hired. Kip was in Paris at the time, and we had the impression that perhaps somebody is after him, though we don't quite know why. And he's taken this job in part to get out of Paris. Thinks he can hide on the boat in a way out in the middle of the Burgundy countryside. But he soon finds that while he's gotten himself out of one jam, he's gotten into another that he doesn't understand. And yet the tension on the boat is very high. There are, in a sense, two groups on the boat. There's the crew, which consists of Kip, an American, Dilip, the skipper, who's from Sri Lanka, Diane, a woman in her late 30s, who's the owner, and Anne, a young Australian who is the cook. That's one side, kind of an upstairs, downstairs kind of thing. The other people on the boat are Brigitte, a very attractive young woman who is the mistress of a very wealthy businessman from Marseille named Marius Carbone, who brought her to the boat, stayed overnight. He was there with his two bodyguards, and then he is left, leaving the two bodyguards behind. One is named Paul. Anne characterizes him as stupid, but at least he's vicious. And Serge, who is quite a bit older, has a much more even keel. But they are both armed, and they seem to be bodyguards for Brigitte, the young woman, but also seem to be keeping her under watch throughout their time. And Kip doesn't really understand what's going on, and nobody in the crew will tell him. There are some nice moments, and as we pick this episode up, Anne is, as I say, she's Australian. She's in the main galley cleaning up after dinner. And in the crew galley, which is a very tight little room, Diane, the owner, and Dilip, the skipper, and Kip have just finished up dinner and are relaxing. On one of these enjoyable evenings we had together, as Anne cleaned up in the main galley, Diane stood in the doorway of our little galley and sang a French song about lying in bed smoking after making love. She blinked a lot as she sang and needed to steady herself against the door frame. At one point, Dilip had to grab her arm to keep her from falling. He shot me a look that told me I hadn't noticed anything, confirming my growing realization that she spent a lot of those solitary hours in her cabin listening to her sad songs and drinking. I wondered what had happened in her life to give it such melancholy. When she finished her song, I rose and offered her my seat. She waved me down, but I could see it pleased her. Behind her, Dilip motioned for me to insist. Très gentil, she said, very kind. She lifted her empty wine bottle. Someone go ask Anne for a bottle of the Côte du Rhône. I was nearest the door, so volunteered. As I came into the galley, I saw that Anne wasn't alone. Paul, the younger bodyguard, had come around the counter that marked the border separating Anne's galley from the dining area and put his arm around her waist. When she tried to bat him away, he pulled her around roughly and grabbed her arm. "Get your fucking hands off me," she said, her face red with anger and not a little bit of fear. He made a nasty sort of laugh. "Leave her alone." I said it in English, but Paul didn't need a translation. He pushed her aside, knocking her against the stove, and turned on me. In French, he replied, "Shut up and mind your own business." Fueled by a couple of drinks and the memory of him chewing me out earlier that day, I entered the galley in a reckless mood. I said, "Leave her alone." A more cautious part of me asked what in the hell I thought I was doing. Paul leered at Anne over his shoulder. "I know her type. She's been wanting me to do this since I came on board." "Like bloody hell!" Anne shouted. This was all said in a mix of French and English and Australian, but we understood each other perfectly. Paul scowled at Anne, maybe for refusing him, or maybe for me being there to see it. Embarrassed now as well as angry, he came at me from behind the counter. At my father's insistence, I'd taken some martial arts classes as a kid, but I'm not much of a fighter. Still, I stood my ground, taking heart in my righteousness, and like any dopey guy, unwilling to back down with a young woman watching. Man, was he fast. I saw his right start to come up, and the next thing I knew I was on the floor. Pushed by adrenaline and quick reflexes, I jumped up before I'd felt the full impact of the blow. He came at me again, and might have really beaten the shit out of me, but before he could throw another punch, Diane burst into the cabin, letting loose a stream of curses that straightened him up better than any champ's uppercut could have done. Dilip came in behind her and jumped between Paul and me, letting Paul know he'd be happy to take him on. That's when Serge came out of his room to see what the commotion was. We all froze in place, like misbehaving children when Dad walks into the room. He looked at each of us in turn, and when he'd sized things up, he shot Paul a dead-eyed glare and cocked his chin toward the passageway behind him. Paul tried to maintain his tough guy thing, raising his head and sticking his chin out as he walked out, but he wasn't fooling anyone. Serge gave us a look that said if things needed to be set right, he'd do the setting, then followed Paul out. An instant later, we heard the sound of someone stumbling up the passageway after being shoved in the back, followed by the slam of 2 doors. As the 2 of them disappeared, the punch that had knocked me down truly hit home. The deck under my feet suddenly felt oddly uneven, and I leaned against the counter to steady myself. Anne was rubbing her arm where Paul had grabbed her. In the emotional hangover of the brief fight, I thought she might cry, but she held herself together very well. She didn't trust her voice, though, to speak, but she gave me a look that let me know she appreciated what I'd done. Dilip winced at the swelling on my face. "You'd better put some ice on that." I let out a shaky breath and thanked him for having my back. "Don't think I was trying to protect you. I just thought that if there was a line forming up to take a swing at that son of a bitch, I wanted to be at the head of it." But he said it with the first real smile he'd given me, and I knew that though it had cost me getting my chops busted, he and I were going to be all right now. Dilip took Diane's arm and started leading her back to her cabin. Before he got her out the door, she stopped, looked over her shoulder at me, and called out in English, "Stout fellow!" She said it in the way you might say "good boy" to a dog, but I felt as pleased as if she had printed a medal on me. On her way out, she gave a toss of her head in the direction of the guest rooms and muttered, "Bastards." Meaning, I thought, all of them. The 2 bodyguards and Bridget, and especially Marius Carbone, who was no longer on the boat, but had turned it over to them. It made me wonder again what hold Carbone had on Diane, and what these 3, Paul, Serge, and Brigitte, were doing here. A pleasure cruise without pleasure is a peculiar thing. So there you have it. Another little selection from To Live and Die in the Floating World, which comes out this fall. Next week, I'll be back to you again, probably with another little video where I might even make a little ad. So, thank you for staying with me. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.